Good morning, 3-4. The Monster's Ring by Bruce Colville. Chapter 7. Russell goes berserk. Russell bounded off the desk. His heart was pounding, and the beast in his blood was going wild. Some of the kids screamed. Others began to edge away from him. "Russell!" cried Mrs. Snurgle. "Stop that this instant!" She stood up and flung off her cape. The storytelling witch was gone, replaced by an angry teacher. Russell snarled at her. Somewhere inside him, a tiny voice was crying, "This is crazy! Crazy! Stop it! Stop it now!" But the monster part of him wouldn't listen. His snarl deepened to a growl as he realized the one thing he really wanted to do: get Eddie. With a roar, Russell charged out the door and across the hall to Mrs. Brown's room. Her door was closed, but monsters didn't bother to knock. He flung it open and burst through. His entrance earned a squeal of terror from the kids. Russell raised his arms and snarled. All the kids, Eddie included, ran to the corner farthest from the door. Mrs. Brown, who had been teaching for 40 years, was not so easily intimidated. "Young man, you leave this room this instant," she ordered. Russell jumped onto the desk and he howled. "Arr!" "You heard me," cried Mrs. Brown. "Get off that desk and out of my room." When Russell didn't move, she grabbed her broom and she whacked him. He yelped with rage and jumped down, but instead of fleeing the room, he headed for the corner where the children were huddled. At that same instant, Miss Snurgle staggered through the door. "Russell," she cried, "stop!" He glanced over his shoulder, hesitating for just a second, but it was too late. His prey was in striking range. He couldn't stop now. Raising his claws, he headed for Eddie. "Oh, no, you don't," yelled Mrs. Brown. Then she hit him on the head with her broom. Russell spun around in blind fury. Mrs. Brown whacked him again. Half the children were laughing, the other half were crying. Russell was roaring with outrage. "Get out of here, whoever you are," snapped Mrs. Brown, "and don't ever come back." The Russell monster hesitated, torn between getting at his enemy and getting away from the ferocious teacher. He turned toward Eddie and snarled again. Mrs. Brown swatted him across the backside. That was enough for the monster. Russell started for the door. Mrs. Brown charged after him. "Out of my room, you ruffian!" she cried. "And stay out!" Russell vaulted the desk, then shot past Mrs. Snurgle, who looked as if she were about to faint. Entering the hall, he ran smack dab into a class heading for its homeroom. He dashed in the middle of the group, growling and snarling. The kids screamed, and they scattered. He sped past them, raced down the hall, rounded the corner, and ran straight into another class. He turned and headed back the other way, the way he had come. From behind he heard someone cry, "Let's get him!" He plunged back into the first class, which had just started to regroup. They slowed him down enough for the second class to catch up. Shrieking and giggling, kids began to pull at his fur, trying to remove the costume. Russell's monster side went wild. A huge, nearly unbelievable roar broke out of his lungs. The children shrank back, and he escaped, but almost instantly, both classes were after him again. The wild rumpus attracted the children still in their rooms. Doors flew open. Heedless of their teachers' cries, kids poured into the hall to join the merry chase. Merry for everyone but Russell. Yelping in fright, he was skidding around corners and down halls as fast as his powerful legs would carry him. But the floors were freshly waxed, and he slipped, and he slid, and he couldn't get a lead on his pursuers. He dodged into the cafeteria. The mob followed. Russell took to the tabletops. Several great leaps carried him from one side of the lunchroom to the other. The pursuing mass of kids had to split and flow along the narrow spaces between the tables, which gained Russell some time. Just ahead of him was another door. A little way past that was the door to the outside and freedom. But standing in the first doorway, blocking Russell's path, was the original beast of Boardman Road, Mr. Henry Rafschnitz himself. Well, for a moment, Russell panicked. Then his monster side took over. Standing on the edge of the table, he gave a deep-throated roar, flexed his legs, and leaped straight at the principal. Mr. Rafschnitz held his ground for an instant. Then, as he saw that the monster really intended to land on him, he dropped to the floor. Russell shot right over him and into the hall. He hurtled forward, flung open the big glass doors, and burst through to the golden afternoon. Miss Schnurgle, who had somehow made it to the head of the chase, came running after him. Mr. Rafschnitz grabbed the doors and locked the rest of the howling mob in. "Russell," cried Mrs. Schnurgle. "Russell, come back. I want to talk to you." But the sunlight was bringing him to his senses, and he was terrified. Sprinting across the playground, he headed into the little wood that separated the school from the housing tract behind it. Scrambling up an old oak, he hid behind the scarlet leaves, where he leaned against the trunk, gasping for breath. What had he done? He had to turn him back to himself and fast. He looked down at the ring. It was glowing. Grabbing it with his claws of his left hand, he tried to twist it. But to his horror, it wouldn't budge. Cold fear gripped at his heart as he tried again. But his monster paws were larger than his hands had been, and the ring, which had moved so easily on his human finger, was just too tight. He tried again, straining mightily. The ring seemed to clutch at his flesh. Fortunately, the increase in size that had made the ring so tight had also given him new strength. Locking his claws against the stone, he wrenched at it with all his might, then howled in pain as the ring finally moved on his finger. Muttering the chant, he gave it 2 full turns. Seconds later, the beast was gone. In its place was Russell. Quiet Russell, who had frightened 4 classes, snarled at 2 teachers, and terrified 1 principal. Timid Russell, who had started the first riot in the history of Boardman Road Elementary School. Quiet, timid Russell, who was in more trouble than he had ever dreamed of in his entire life. Ooh.